Live, trance, and prosper. Hi, I'm Dr. Brian David Phillips, and welcome to Different Ecstatic States. I apologize to those of you who are here live, who are having issues with the chat room. I went in last night, tried to fix it, and this morning I got some connections with them, but it seems to be broken in terms of the video. And since we want audio and we want video, I need to broadcast for the webinar. Otherwise, it's not really a webinar, is it? So, unfortunately, there is that. And so I had to drop it. It is very much wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, as Nathan says. We're going to go ahead and go tour. Today's different ecstatic states. We're going to look at ecstatic states in different contexts. Now, I will be going to Sydney, Australia in August for a Deep Inside the Mind Ecstatic, August 23 and 24. We'll be in Sydney for that, and you can go to my website, www.briandavidphillips.net, and check out the info on that. Now, for that particular course, we're going to be doing a lot with ecstatic states, particularly in terms of erotic hypnosis. And erotic hypnosis is one form of ecstatic states. And if you're interested in that course, you can check a video I uploaded just today on the sort of things that we will be doing in that course. But that's not the only sort of ecstatic states. There are many contexts that an ecstatic state is used. Either naturally or artificially, as in directed. Sometimes we have spontaneous ecstatic states. You get very, very good news and boom, you're in ecstasy, you're in joy. But we're not really, in terms of ecstatic states and experiential trance, we're not just talking about happiness or random levels of, oh, that's nice, I feel rather good about that. Rather, we're discussing when we enter into a trance state that brings us into ecstasy. And that ecstasy can be sexual, and it's pretty awesome when it is, but that ecstasy can also be many other types of ecstasy, depending upon the context. Now, one of the oldest forms of ecstasy in terms of trance is, of course, religious ecstasy. And most ancient cultures had a form of ritual that guided participants into ecstasy, ecstatic trance, or ecstatic religious experience. The ecstatic experience could be something as simple as you feel as if you're channeling the spirit of the god. Today, there are still religions that rely upon ecstatic states. Not all of them. It's quite interesting that early Christianity, for instance, had quite a few branches or sects that used ecstatic trance. The ecstatics would feel as if deity has gone into them and entered them, and they suddenly feel bliss. And if you are familiar with my exotic hypnosis inductions, there is a particular method that I teach in that program called positive state overload, where we induce trance and then we guide a person into a positive system, and then we overload that, and so they're overwhelmed with it. It's a flood. It's an ecstatic flood. And that is essentially what ecstatics would experience. They feel the love of God and things like that. Now, among Christians today, very few sects currently practice ecstatic states, at least knowingly. The Pentecostals would be an exception to that, as would the Shakers and others. In Pentecostal, evangelical Pentecostalism, there's a concept of being touched by the Spirit or the fire of the Holy Spirit, where there's a sense that God enters. And if you go on YouTube and you look up those things, you see folks flopping around on the floor. Glossolalia is an ecstatic experience. Glossolalia is speaking in tongues. And when I say that's an ecstatic experience, in terms of trance work, I mean genuine glossolalia. Well, genuine is relative. Whether or not they're actually speaking a language that works is debatable. Certainly, the founders of the Pentecostal movement went to China because they believed when they experienced glossolalia that they were speaking Chinese. Well, they got to China to do ministry work and found out that that wasn't Chinese. That was just a bunch of gibberish. But at least they had an ecstatic state, and it flowed through them. It may not be an objective reality, but it was certainly a subjective trance experience reality. Now, those kind of experience are genuine ecstatic states. Today, if you're watching TV, particularly in the United States, there are folks who do speaking in tongues as part of their religious service, and I can say that honestly, the vast majority of the ones that I've seen, the TV preachers who speak in tongues, are in psychology. There's a technical term. I teach a lot of social influence as well, and the technical term for this would be they're bullshit artists. They're just making shit up. They're just and they pretend that they're touched by the Spirit. Really, they're just speaking gibberish. That's gibberish. And it's gibberish that is consciously created. They may be very good at it, and certainly if you practice improv, you can learn to be very good at that sort of gibberish creation, but it's gibberish nonetheless. They're not genuinely in a trance state. Unfortunately, in some of these religious movements, some folks who guide others into ecstatic states, they are snake oil salesmen. They're manipulators. There are some, and I'm not saying that the majority are crooks, but there certainly are some who are not. And some very well-meaning folks who take the experience, which they believe is spiritual, and they ascribe it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. Another form of religious ecstatic state might be active prayer. A lot of folks, when they pray, and this is particularly true in Western culture, but I've seen it here where I live in the exotic East, folks who really don't pray. There's a wonderful section in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, where a group of folks ask Christ, Jesus, how do we pray? And Jesus said, well, let me tell you this. And Jesus didn't actually talk that way. He talked that way in Aramaic. But Jesus essentially said, well, here's what you do. And he taught them the Lord's Prayer. All right. But he taught them a simple technique. Now, we only have the words that were spoken, and they're like 5th, 6th, 7th, 10th hand from the source. Okay. None of the witnesses to Jesus' life wrote any of the epistles or the Gospels. These were texts that were based upon somebody else's texts and things like that. And I realize just by saying that, some folks will consider me speaking heresy. But those folks are what we would call idiots. They don't know the history of their own religion. Because any scholar of the Bible certainly understands that this is the case, that you're talking about third, fourth, fifth-hand sources. None of the eyewitnesses wrote their material. The closest we have to that, of course, is John on Patmos, who may have been related to that. But even he, you're talking a long time after the events. But we only know the words to the Lord's Prayer. We don't know what else he said in terms of context. It's very likely that he taught them to enter into a meditative or trance state while speaking the words so that they connect to deity. And now I say this because that's how a lot of folks who followed the traditions that Christ was teaching from handled it. They would enter into a meditative state. And by meditative state here, I mean an experiential meditative state. I don't mean close your eyes and think about the Super Bowl or what's on TV. In a active prayer, and I've got a webinar on active prayer if you want to check that out on my site. But in active prayer, you enter into state and experientially connect your imagination. You intensify your imaginative involvement with the divine, whether the divine is real or not. You can be an atheist and do this stuff, but if you are a religious person, then you connect yourself to that divine that you feel connected to, and it flows through you as you perform the prayer. One thing about Jesus was he wasn't really a big public prayer guy. He advocated private experiences for prayer, for that ecstatic state as a private thing. He actually condemned folks who stood out in the middle of the street and, "I'm praying to you, oh Lord." He thought that was kind of showing off and that you're being a dick. But prayer is a means of doing it. Now, of course, parallel to trance ecstasy in human cultural history, pretty much as long as our species has been around. We know that species that were related to us but older than us, like the Neanderthal and the Denisovans, that they used psychedelic drugs or plants to enter into ecstatic states for their connections. I really am interested in psychedelic states. Psychedelic states are a form of ecstatic state. The thing is about psychedelica is that it can be done through chemical means, herbs and spices and things like that, and just getting drunk. But it can also be done through trance work. When you go to my website and you look at all the drinking finger things, where I say, and as the finger gets right, you get drunker and drunker, and folks, they feel drunk when I touch them on the forehead. Just go to my blog site, BRIANDAVIDPHILLIPS.net, and type in the search engine, drinking finger or drunk, and you'll find lots of examples of that. But essentially, that's an ecstatic state. It's a non-religious ecstatic state. But in our prehistory, those ecstatic states were often placed in a ritualized context, sometimes with interesting results, with the Dionysians running around, the Bacchae having their drunken orgy with some young man. Everybody gets drunk, everybody has sex, and then they rip the guy apart and bury his body in a field. Yay. But there really are a lot of things like that. Oh, yes, okay. Sorry, the comment just came through. Nathan makes a comment about the Lord's Prayer I was speaking about earlier, and that even in his lifetime, he's a young man, that the Lord's Prayer has changed. The language has been updated and certain phrases have been removed. And we see that. Religion itself and the use of ecstatic states evolves over time. Okay? And part of the language changing is the translation. When we go to earlier sources, we see things, but over time things get added and changed. And today there's debate on whether or not to go back to certain earlier sources or to keep certain changes that go along with how things are. Excuse me very much. Now, sometimes to induce ecstasy, psychological ecstasy, we use trance techniques of inducing trance. If you're using Qigong, you essentially breathe in the Qi and then you allow it to flow. For me, when I do self-hypnosis or self-trance work, I allow myself to enter an experiential state. One thing I do is, simply because I have a heavy kinesthetic element, is I put my hands up, and then what I'll do is I'll breathe in and drop into state. And I allow myself to allow my arms and my body, depending upon where I am, begins moving. Now, as you watch me, you see the hands moving, and I want to clarify that I can speak to you and still do this, but the thing is, this is not a conscious movement. My hands are essentially becoming automatisms. It's an autonomic movement, or an autonomic ideomotor movement, actually. I'm not consciously moving it. I'm just breathing and telling myself to allow the energy to come through me. Now, the energy I'm feeling, and I feel it, it's like a tingling sensation. It may or may not be genuine. Those who practice Qigong would say this is a genuine energy, but it may just be a metaphor that my unconscious mind creates that allows the movements. And I know that I've seen myself do this before. I've watched videos, and I know it looks a lot like a Qigong practice, but it's essentially similar to that, but it's not. Okay, my hands have now gone into a mudra, I can feel. But this is a form of ecstatic state. I haven't overloaded the sensations yet, but I can accelerate it any way I wish. Now, here's the thing about Qigong, and in Asia, where I live, a lot of folks practice this, and they practice Tai Chi, which is a martial art, but it's pretty much an exercise system. Let me pop out of this. Now, it is a flow that occurs. And here's the thing. A lot of folks learn Qigong and they learn Tai Chi, and they learn to allow that flow to happen. Now, what I've been doing, when I let it randomly flow through me, that's very similar to a form of ecstatic practice in Qigong called spontaneous Qigong. And that form, you allow the energy just to take you wherever it takes you. It is an ideomotor state, or ideomotor action tagged to ecstatic states, which can be very fascinating, very wonderful to experience. Some folks become overwhelmed with it. Many practitioners of spontaneous Qigong, which is this improvisational flowing movement, meditate upon the essence of an animal. And so you'll get folks moving around like apes, monkeys, rats, cats, dogs, wolves. I taught a course in Malaysia once and was teaching this kind of process, and a young woman took on the energy of a wolf, and she started crawling around the seminar room, feeling that transformative energy. Sometimes folks, they go into the state and they let it overwhelm themselves so much that they lose the connection or control or efficacy. We want to watch out for that. Actually, spontaneous Qigong, there are some folks who say you shouldn't practice that unless you've been practicing this other stuff for a long time. I disagree. I think it is an ecstatic state that is very helpful. When we look at studies, recently I posted a number of YouTube videos, and on my blog they're there too, information about various scientific studies that show when we meditate, structures in the brain change. I strongly suspect that it's not just meditation. Most of the meditators that they use for the MRA studies, they've been taught mindfulness, or they've been taught other types of meditation that cause a dissociative or emotional overload in the system, an ecstatic state, if you will. Nathan is asking, would possession in shamanic ritual also be a kind of ecstatic trance state? Absolutely. And once more, if we go back to our prehistory, we know that drugs were used to enter the state, and once we get to history, civilization, we have documentation of places like the Oracle of Delphi, where they essentially sniffed gases from the earth that caused the priestess to get high. Or you have the Volpi going through northern Europe, the women who were practicing saving, which is essentially what Freya and Frigga, but Freya brings from the Vanir to the Aesir and teaches Odin how to do saving or seething or cedar, if you prefer, which is shamanic states. And these possession states where we channel, that's an ecstatic state. Now, some folks are going to say, but if I'm possessed by a spirit, that's not an ecstatic state. That's a spirit inhabiting me. Sure, you can believe that if you like, but neurologically, you're going through an ecstatic state. And ecstatic states can be unconscious metaphors for what's happening, okay, how you experience it. If I go into a state and I become a wolf, and I can feel my body changing into a lycanthrope form, and I can feel the fur, I feel structural changes in my jaw. Now, I feel as if it's a real change, but I'm assuming on the video it doesn't look quite so real. It just looks like a bearded fat man doing weird stuff. But I feel that change. And now I'm going to drop it. I'm going to have to watch the video just to see that. But shape-shifting, that's another ecstatic state. You know, magical practice. There's all this stuff of bringing in the gods. I've seen hundreds, probably more, of rituals at temples here in Taiwan where folks carry the god and they are possessed by the deity. I've seen temple practices. I've seen in some interesting little rituals at midnight. One of the first month in Taiwan, I was out with a friend and we went to a little area, a night market, and a priest set up a little area and he did a ritual where he summoned an evil spirit. A demon is what my friend said it was, and he battled that, and you could feel the pressure in the air drop. It got so heavy. So the pressure rose because it got so heavy. but it was fascinating. But he entered into an ecstatic state to deal with that spirit, and then he, of course, he did a spell, and he burned the spell up, and the ashes he sold. But it was obvious from observing him that he was in an ecstatic trance state. If you watch television preachers of whatever denomination or religion who go into state, you watch them for the trance signs. Watch for the rapid eye movement. Watch for the breathing. Watch for the lacrimation. Watch for the lassitude in the face and the body. Other rituals can be used that are physical in nature. Physical repetitiveness can create a trance state that can then be used as an avenue for ecstasy. When we watch the whirling dervishes use a form of trance dance, which is an ecstatic state. Spinning around and around and around naturally makes us dizzy. Okay? That's a physiological response, dizziness. But that dizziness can be used as a physiological doorway to create an ecstatic trance state. So if I'm dizzy and I open myself to the divine, I then create a positive emotional flood. Okay? The question, we're getting a question of in the Monty Python's Holy Grail. Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail. There's a scene where someone says, "She turned me into a newt. I got better." Is that an ecstatic state? No, because he was lying. That particular character was lying in order to allow them to burn a woman to execute a woman as a witch. However, some folks, when they go through those, they do feel like they've gone through those transformations, either through the occult or witchcraft or others. Zombies are essentially in a trance state. Now, whether it's an ecstatic state or not, I'm not sure. It depends on the method to deliver it. But shamanic practices, dervishes, when they whirl, are going through an ecstatic induction. They use a physiological state. Now, here in Taiwan, there are different trance dances. Every culture has them. The American Indian Church has a number of dances that employ trance to create an ecstatic state connected to deity. But in Taiwan, there's a beautiful dance that Aboriginals do, which is the Maiden's Dance. And these girls with really long hair, essentially, they get in a line, just as the whirling dervishes often whirl together, either individually spinning or even more likely they are holding hands and going in a large circle. And if you've done Ouija dancing with me, you are aware of how you can enter that kind of state. But in the Maiden's Dance, it's the water maidens. But the girls with really long hair, they're holding hands and they're doing this movement, a very broad movement. I'm too big to do it. And I'm next to my desk, I'll whack my head. But what they do is they'll bend at the waist quickly, and essentially their hair touches the ground and flings back. And it's very beautiful to watch. But what happens with the girls is, it's the maidens, they enter into a state. Now, why are they entering into a state? They're entering into an ecstatic state because it's a ritualized context. And going into church or temple or sacred grove are ritualized contexts that increases expectancy. So as in hypnosis, we want to increase expectancy in order to create states. That's what we're doing there. Now, also, because of the ritual, but also something interesting, just like the whirling causes a physiological response that can be used as a rider for entering trance state, this motion of whirling the body and the head, they're essentially putting their head forward and back. Forward and back. Gee, I wonder if there are any modern forms of music where people whirl their heads back and forth. Perhaps even banging their heads or head banging. Heavy metal fans who are head bangers, they do this movement to the music and they feel awesome while they're doing it. Why are they doing that? Well, it's partly because human beings naturally respond to a strong bass. Recently, just within the last week, news media covered a study that did MRIs of people listening to music, and they found that people responded very positively in the brain. The brain responds very positively to a heavy bass. So heavy metal has a lot of heavy bass, and we move to that bass, to that beat. Okay, humans are naturally responsive to rhythm. Okay, a recent study on chimpanzees found that the music they prefer has a particular rhythmic note to it. They respond as well. Well, they're cousins, so of course. But humans respond to rhythm. They respond to bass. They respond to that, and our bodies respond as well as our minds and our emotions. So we do this movement. But what else is happening with headbangers? When they do this, and the water maidens, when they do this movement, it creates an altered state of consciousness, which can then be used as a rider for ecstatic experience. Now, why would doing this create an altered state? Simple. The brain's not a solid object. The brain is like this mushy jelly thing that's in your skull. And if you whip your skull back and forth, you whip it, not just turn, but back and forth, your brain is sloshing around inside that skull. And so as it sloshes against the side, it's actually causing a little bit of damage. And not enough to hurt you, but enough to create an ecstatic or trance state. Now, that doesn't mean I recommend that you whip your head back and forth. Whip your head back and forth. Because you can actually, headbanging can cause damage. There's quite a few folks, actually in the U.S. about 5 years ago, a lot of middle schools and junior highs were telling kids not to headbang because of damage that they do. They whip too hard and they cause damage to the spine and the neck. And you're also possible to create a concussion, but you have to headbang really hard for that. A few days ago, there was a man in his 50s who was reported on having that sort of experience. There are many physical doorways, such as dizziness, but there are other physical doorways as well. For instance, intense sexual arousal and orgasm. When we look at the MRI scans of folks who are having arousal, the same areas of the brain become activated that are activated during ecstatic states. And when a woman has an orgasm, when a man has an orgasm, the studies I've seen show that women, when they orgasm, it's like a critical factor just shuts off for a moment. And if you wish, you can fire in suggestions for that, and you can intensify. So when someone orgasms, they feel hypersensitive. You can intensify that through visualization. That's why some religious rites, the great rite or the sacred marriage, involves sexuality. It doesn't have to be sexual, but there are different things you can do. Just by having the ritual itself, the context itself, you are building doorways, either through physical environments, a dark place, the sacred above the person so that they're looking up. Because here's the thing about trance is it is actually easier for folks to enter into deep trance experiences, experiential or otherwise, when they're looking up. That's why eye fixation inductions work particularly well when you have a fixation object above the person's eye level, so that there's a slight movement up. There are certain sacred postures. When we look at religious artifacts and we look at religious places for various cultures throughout human history and prehistory, we note that the idol is often placed high and the supplicants are low. It's not just about power. It's also about creating context that is more likely to help folks go into trance. So if I'm looking up, there's this. This is also why the Spiegel eye test works so well. Some of you who are watching the live broadcast, you're familiar with the Spiegel eye test. It's essential. And if you're not, Herbert Spiegel, it's also in the book Trance and Treatment by Herbert Spiegel and his son David Spiegel. But essentially the Spiegel eye test, an abbreviated version. I don't use the full test. I don't use the hypnotic induction profile. I disagree with some of Spiegel's conclusions, but I absolutely agree that this sucker works really well. And essentially you do this. You ask a person, now you can't do this on yourself very well, simply because it's difficult to see your own eyes doing this test. But for those of you unfamiliar with it, have the person keep the head straight. So I'll keep my head straight. Just hold it down. I just ask them, keep the head straight, and then have them look up as high as you can comfortably without hurting yourself, but look up as high as you can, and then slowly, while still looking up, slowly close the eyelids. And once they're closed, relaxed. Okay. Oh. Now, you need to do that relatively quickly because people get kind of tired of looking up and it can be stressful. But here's what you're looking for. When you were watching my eyes, there's a moment as I start closing the eyes, it's a moment I think of as a record skip. It's like almost like, all right. Now, in that moment, as we're looking down, or as we're closing the eyes, did you see more whites in my eyes or more iris? Now, some folks, when you tell them to look up, they can look up, okay? Now, some folks, when you say, look up, they don't really look very high. It's obvious that it's not so high. Now, in the test, as the eyes begin to close, if you see all whites, like zombie eyes, according to Spiegel, that person is highly hypnotizable. Okay? They're naturally gifted. Hypnosis or hypnotizability is both an attribute and a skill. Many of us have a higher aptitude, just like some of us have more aptitude to music or math or language. So some of us have higher aptitude or suggestibility, okay? But we can learn to be better at it. Now, according to Spiegel, the folks who, when I say, look up, and there's nothing, zero, okay? Those folks according to Spiegel, the ones who don't move much or only move a little, those folks Spiegel would say are unhypnotizable. Actually, I don't think they're unhypnotizable, although David Spiegel in his work at Stanford and MRI scans, he says that, and he has a theory that there's a genetic basis, which may or may not be so, but I believe those zeros, or those low responders, are low responders, not no responders. But either way, when we look up, it does indeed, while it's an indicator of who goes into trance more easily, who can do the ecstatic things or other aspects more easily, it's also a technique. So it's a measure of aptitude, and it's a technique. So if you look up slightly, you're more able to do it. That's why when I do the pendulum kind of inductions, I have my pendulum up higher so that they're looking upward. That's also why some other inductions, like the handshake interrupt, I place the hand not directly in front of the face, but a little higher to look into the palm. That's also a physical doorway that can be used to increase the likelihood of entering into a trance state. Now, ecstasy can also be an interesting thing in terms of sensuality. And erotic ecstatic experience is when we overload our positive emotional states like other forms of ecstasy, but we do so in an erotic context. And that can be very, very interesting indeed. Essentially, you're creating a very intriguing experience for a person. And just as I discussed the other aspects, possession, you can do channeling, not channeling in an erotic context, but deep trance identification in an erotic context. You can also do the shape-changing thing in an erotic context. Actually, on my website, you can find some MP3s for feline and wolf lupine and other types of shape-changing in erotic contexts. Yes, and other aspects. Now, I do see we're coming to our mark real soon, and so I real quick want to remind folks to go to my website, okay, and my website right here, www.briandavidphillips.net, and if you look on the left sidebar, you'll see there's a number of upcoming events related to ecstasy. If you're in Australia, please join us in Sydney. You can register now. If you register now, if you're one of the earlier registrars, you get a lot of goodies, awesome goodies. If you're in Taiwan, August 2nd, we're doing Mindgasm, which also will deal with some ecstatic states, and that's going to be a lot of fun. We're doing some hypnotantra and tantric experiences like Kundalini rising or energy orgasms. Those are obviously ecstatic states in and of themselves. Now you can, and I'm going to post, I believe for the Hangouts we're not able, I don't think we're able to do the whole link. So I'm just going to post real quick in the Hangout comments. So if you go to briandavidphillips.net/webinar specials, you can get to some specials that you can take a look at. We've got lots of goodies there through July 15. The specials will be live through July 15. You can get the engineering experiential ecstasy video sets if you like at a much cheaper rate. I've got a whole bunch of video sets there that are much reduced, as well as the big set for the ultimate pleasure hypnotist. And then the webinars. If you use the Ecstatic webinar coupon code before July 15, and that's when it expires, you can get any of our webinars recordings for download that we've had. You can get any of those at 60% off. And that's the thing about the coupon codes. It's only for the webinar recordings, and please, please, please remember to get everything in your cart first and then use the coupon. And double check and make sure you get that 60% off rate before doing the final purchase. Okay? But that's it. Many different contexts for ecstatic states, religious, introspective, recreational, dance. Lots of dance can be single or groups. Psychedelic experiences, drunken experiences, erotic experiences, and just plain old, ooh, that feels good joy. And we can, when we're observing others, we can watch for genuine trance states, signs. Some contexts where it's expected. I've noticed a number of Pentecostals, for instance, when I examine their services, you'll see there's obviously some folks who are going through genuine experiences, and then there are others who kind of go through the motions because they don't want to be left out. So there is a social expectancy, but there are genuine experiences as well. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I will, hopefully the recording's out, and because of the technical difficulties, I will make the recording, if it comes out okay, I will make the recording live for members of the website. They don't have to be premium members because of our problems. I am curious how you, what you thought of the Hangout for the webinars. Some of you who are here right now, I know, have used the Tiny Chat option, which crashed today for us. But in the past, it's worked okay. And how are you seeing this versus that, in terms of quality of the video, as well as the ability to interact? I apologize for getting everything started a little slow today. I know it can be very frustrating, but until next time, I'll probably be, by the way, I'll be posting more webinars. We're going to get back to a monthly, at least a monthly schedule for those coming up for different topics, some related to this, some related to other topics, and sometimes we'll just do a general chat for those with an interest. But I'd like to thank you for being here, and until next time, live trance and prosper. Bye-bye.